Welcome to Bazza's podcast, brought to you by Barry York from the land down under. We discuss popular culture, history and politics. Our motto is, question everything. Welcome to episode 6, featuring Ken Mansell, who is Australia's preeminent historian when it comes to researching, recording and preserving the history of the 1960s and 1970s radical left movement in Australia. In this podcast we talk about oral history. When, how and why did Ken become involved with it? Ken is a folk singer and songwriter. He was born in Melbourne in 1945. We first met due to our involvement in the Vietnam protest movement against America's war in Vietnam. Ken has recorded about 320 interviews. In the early 1980s, he recorded interviews with 100 members and former members of the Communist Party of Australia, those who had been in the party in the 1940s and 1950s, and some even who were active in the 1930s. He has also recorded a similar number of New Left activists of the late 60s and early 1970s. He also had a book published called Wizards of the Wheel, 1945 to 1965, on a non-political topic of cycling in Australia. He interviewed 90 cyclists for that project. He's also interviewed about 20 footballers. Ken's The Yeast is Red, A History of the Bakery, 1968 to 1971, is available online. It deals with the bakery, which was the off-campus centre of the Monash Labour Club. When did you first become aware of oral history?
Well, I have no doubt that it was to do with the work of Wendy Lowenstein. Wendy's regarded by many as the pioneer of oral history in Australia. I had quite a bit to do with Wendy in the 60s, starting as early as probably 1964. One of my songs was published in her folk music magazine Tradition. The song was The Voyager, which I wrote in January 1964, pretty soon after the actual disaster where the Voyager, an Australian naval warship, crashed into the Melbourne, or was it the other way around? They crashed together in Jervis Bay in New South Wales. Wendy was very keen to encourage me in songwriting, and over the subsequent 2 or 3 years I visited her on a number of occasions, mainly to talk about my songs, probably to encourage her to publish more than what she already had, actually. But we got to know each other. I was aware then, and I'm talking probably sort of about the late 60s and early 70s, I was aware that she was engaged in field trips. And a lot of those field trips which she conducted were documented in Tradition magazine. I suspect she was probably influenced by Studs Terkel, the American broadcaster who had a radio program in Chicago and probably was the pioneer in the English-speaking world of oral history and its broadcast. He would interview people and then broadcast the interviews on his radio program in Chicago. And over a number of years, he published quite a lot of books. Well, his book, which was an oral history of the Great Depression, was published in 1970. Now, that probably had some influence on Wendy, insofar as 8 years later, she published Weevils in the Flower, which was her own oral history of the Great Depression in Australia. I think I can remember her talking about Studs Terkel, actually. On a number of times when I visited her house in Westbourne Street, Paran, she drew my attention to her tape collection. I vaguely remember actually seeing her tape collection, because at that time, of course, she wouldn't have donated them to the National Library, as she eventually did. and to the State Library of Victoria, as she eventually did. She and Verna were going on field trips in their car, taking the two children with them, Marty and Richard. They collected an enormous amount of material, and what they were looking for was the common person. Wendy would have subscribed. In fact, I know she subscribed to the idea that common folk had been hidden from history, because academic history in particular had always been influenced by the ruling class outlook that what mattered most were the activities of the important people, the rich and the famous, the kings, queens, princesses, lords, ladies. In fact, social history was probably a latecomer in academic history, because the standard 19th century history, particularly in England, would have probably focused mainly on the activities of the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie. And then eventually oral history was to become a part of social history, documenting the activity and through the memories and stories of ordinary people. At this time, that when Weevils in the Flower was being sold, and after I bought a copy, I was at Swinburne completing my Bachelor of Arts in Sociology and Modern Government. Unfortunately, I didn't have an academic training in history or history writing, and that was to have its consequences later on. But I was finishing off my BA, and I was doing a unit with Kelvin Rowley, who was one of the student radicals of the 60s, who'd written a lot for Arena magazine, was very involved at Melbourne University and in particular the Melbourne University Labour Club, was prolific in his writing. For some of us anyway, he was an intellectual giant. He was running the course, and it was sort of like an economic history course. And I managed to persuade him to let me do an essay on the Communist Party, because I'd just seen this film called Menace, which had been produced by John Hughes, a left-wing filmmaker in Melbourne. And I think Menace came out in sometime early 1979, and it showed the Cold War hysteria against the Australian Communist Party. It had interviews with people like Dorothy Gibson and Joan Goodwin and the Coonahans. Also actually had Mick Coonahan in it at one point, I think, the film. And Sandra Zerbo, I think, was actually in it as well. But I think I wanted to do my little bit to document the Cold War in Melbourne. So I lined up Wendy for an interview, and she brought along a woman called Jill, whose surname I don't think I ever got to actually know. Anyway, I interviewed Jill and Wendy for about 2 hours. I've still got that interview. They were talking about the Eureka Youth League, being in the EYL in the late 40s and taking food and vegetables down to the striking miners in Wonthaggi during the coal strike, the national coal strike. A lot of good stuff like that. I found that a really enjoyable experience. But actually, it wasn't my first oral history interview. It was only my second. The first oral history interview I ever did, in fact, was done with my clunky old national reel-to-reel tape recorder in June 1969 in Greville Street, Prahran, with an old cobbler called Bill Jennery, who'd been in the Wobblies, the IWW in Australia or in Melbourne, in World War I, or around the time of World War I. He was in it, I think he was a member for about 4 or 5 years. And that interview is now on the National Library, or accessible on the National Library of Australia website. I was introduced to Bill Jennery by Jill Jolliffe, who, along with Ron Lawson, her partner, owned the Alice's Restaurant Bookshop 2 doors down from the bakery being the headquarters for about 2 years of the Monash Labour Club, and in 1969 also the headquarters of the Revolutionary Socialist Alliance, before the Revolutionary Socialist Alliance was transformed into the Worker Student Alliance. So I did my interview with Bill Jennery, and that was an important interview because in 1969 there wouldn't have been too many former Wobblies still around. He had a very vivid recall of his experiences in the IWW. He knew a lot of the key activists in the Wobblies at the time. He even knew Monty Miller, who was active at Eureka. He described, his friendship with Monty Miller. Can you imagine me sitting there completely awestruck?
Yeah.
Not only did he have a great recall of the events of the time around World War I, but he just he just started singing all these wobbly songs. He didn't even have to look at a book or look at notes. I actually took with me the Little Red Songbook of the IWW with me to jog his memory, but he didn't need it. He was just singing them. And this was a month after the great national general strike, which followed upon the jailing of Clary O'Shea of the Tramways Union over the penal powers. And Bill had written a song about Clary O'Shea. So I got it on tape virtually in the month that it was written or composed. So that was wonderful. So that was my real first interview. So 1979 was the interview with Wendy and Jill. Now, something else happened just after that, which was also very influential. And that was the conference that was held in Melbourne called the Communists and Labour Movement Conference. Communist and Labour Movement Conference was held in Melbourne, organised by the Communist Party essentially. And what they'd done was to round up about 100 former members, and maybe quite a lot of members who were still members, and they divided. It was held over 3 or 4 days at Melbourne Uni. There were sessions, probably about 60 or 70 sessions altogether, and they recorded it. And because I was aware that it had been recorded, I was on the lookout for when the tapes would become available. Eventually, the recordings of the conference became available at the State Library in Melbourne, and I spent weeks going in there virtually every day, ordering a particular tape or tapes and listening to them just to, hear them again. Because obviously one couldn't attend all the sessions, so I wanted to hear the sessions that I hadn't been able to attend because they had sessions running concurrently. So that alerted me, I think, to the richness of people's memory. And I compared the wonderful memories that were on show at that conference to hear with the dry as bone, purely factual history of the Communist Party that had been written by Alistair Davidson around 1969. I was extremely critical of Davidson's book from a number of points of view, mainly because it concentrated on the leadership aspect rather than the activities of the rank and file. I had historiographical and methodological differences with it, and it started me on my own trajectory of trying to uncover the social history of the Communist Party. In 1981, I started out on my PhD and I decided to include oral history. I started almost immediately collecting oral history, and over the course of the next 3 years, I did about 100 interviews with people who were members of the Communist Party in the 40s and 50s. Some had already been members in the 30s. Just for example, Jim Munro, who finished up being the State Secretary of the Liquor Trades Union, he was a member of the unemployed workers movement in the early Depression years, probably a member of the militant minority as well. So there were people who were around in the early 30s, but essentially I was covering and looking at the 40s and 50s, which was what my thesis topic was about. It's a long story, but I didn't complete the PhD for a number of reasons, partly due to my poor methodology. Secondly, also, I had to make a choice between continuing to be active in the nuclear disarmament movement or continue on with my PhD as main priority. In the end, I chose to continue my activity in the nuclear disarmament movement.
So when did you, the current type of research that you've been doing about the Vietnam period, when did that begin?
I started I did a master's at Melbourne Uni starting in 1991. When I started at Melbourne Uni in 1991, all I had was a BA honours degree because I didn't get an MA at La Trobe. So I had a BA honours. So I wanted to get an MA as a first step. Now, I did it through the Australian Centre at Melbourne Uni with David Goodman as my supervisor.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
And over at working part-time, I was teaching at Kings Park Secondary College in the western suburbs of Melbourne from 1989 through to 1992. So I was working full-time and studying part-time, but I managed to get my MA while working full-time. It was a bit of a slog. So what I did for my MA was coursework, and I did a thesis, which was a minor thesis really, but it turned out to be a major thesis in many respects in that it was path-breaking in some respects. It was The East is Red, which you are familiar with. Yeah, The East is Red. Now, I did use oral history for The East is Red. The East is Red was completed at the very beginning of 1994. By then, by the time I finished The East is Red, I'd probably conducted already about 20 or 30 interviews, and I used about a dozen of those interviews in the actual The East is Red. But what I meant by saying that it was path-breaking or unusual as a thesis or as a piece of history writing was that I actually featured an oral history interview with myself. Now, let me explain. What I had was simulated diary entries scattered throughout the thesis, The East is Red, where, for instance, I would, because I lived at the bakery, you see, so I had direct first-hand experience of what it was like to live there, what it felt like to live there. I had the memories of the everyday, the immediacy of the surroundings, the everyday occurrences that would otherwise be completely lost to history, in that if you're relying only on leaflets, letters, newspaper accounts, newspaper cuttings, etc., you're getting part of the story. In fact, you might even have almost the whole story, but you haven't got the whole story. And I felt that one of the reasons I chose the bakery as my topic, I was sitting in my office at Kings Park one day and it just suddenly hit me, by God, it's the perfect topic, the bakery. I live there. Not only have I got all the leaflets as they came off the cassette machine, but I've also got all the memories inside my head. You know, this is perfect. So I decided to sort of use these memories as a sort of a simulated diary where I'd sort of say, I was walking up the circular staircase of the bakery today and I noticed there was some leaflets on the kitchen table which had been left there by the SID kids. They're having their meeting downstairs. There's a lot of noise down there because Albert Langer and Julian Shaw are arguing about the merits of the Vanguard Party as against the anarchist theory put forward, which Julian accepts, of Daniel Cohn-Bendit. And
SID was Students in Dissent, is that right?
Students in Dissent.
Yep.
So I knew that I thought actually that my history supervisor and the history department would frown upon this because, you know, well, partly for all the reasons that academic historians have always rejected oral history because it's subjective. I mean, how was the reader to know that I wasn't making this up? You know, I mean, I had this little bit in there where at the Left Action Conference in 1969, after the conference had finished, a lot of us went down to the pub in Sussex Street, and Mavis Robinson was sitting there with her jug of beer, and Jeff Hogg and I were sitting there, and Jeff and I got to know each other a little bit because I drove him up from Melbourne to Sydney for the conference. And he made some remark about how wonderful Enver Hoxha was. And she dropped her bloody beer. She could not believe what she was. And I won't tell you which side I was on. I think you can guess, can't you?
It is a good example, though, of things like that do capture the subjective dimension.
Exactly.
It adds a layer of depth to the understanding of what happened.
Yeah, of course. And the sort of by adding all those things into the thesis, like for instance, when Adrian Desailly and I were arrested, painting up one night, and finished up in Pentridge, for a day. There's one or two leaflets that record that, but they don't record what it was like getting arrested or what happened to us or anyway. I'm just, you know what I'm trying to say, that The oral history fills gaps. And I'll read you a quote I have here from Paul Thompson's book, The Voice of the Past. Are you familiar with that book?
Yes.
He says, in the most general sense, once the life experience of people of all kinds can be used as its raw material, a new dimension is given to history. Oral history provides a source quite similar in a character to published autobiography, but much wider in scope. Oral history is a history built around people. It thrusts life into history itself and it widens its scope. The tape recorder not only allows history to be taken down in spoken words, but also to be presented through them. The use of a human voice, fresh, personal, particular, always brings the past into the present with extraordinary immediacy. The words may be idiosyncratically phrased, but all the more expressive for that. They breathe life into history. Now, while we're on that topic of what advantages can be gained by using oral history, I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that one of the original criticisms by academic historians against the use of oral history, certainly in university history departments, was that it's subjective. It represents a subjective view as distinct from the so-called or presumed objective nature of the documentary written or printed source. So the printed source was always regarded as being authoritative, whereas the memory of a person was subject to doubt because of the propensity of the human memory to either fade or alter the reality of the past or romanticise the past. I was always very aware of that as a precautionary principle. I knew that one had to be very cautious in the use of my interviews and the material, because how can you be absolutely sure or sure at all that the person isn't at least a little bit, either consciously or deliberately or non-deliberately, making it up? So for me, as a general principle, the printed source or the documented source is primary and the oral memory is secondary. I'm not saying that the oral memory isn't important. It is very important if used properly, but it must be regarded as secondary because you can't dispute what is in a written or printed document. It might be factually wrong about what it's talking about, but the fact that it's actually talking is a fact which can't be disputed. You see what I'm saying? Whereas the oral memory is subject to verification. And the way you verify it is by checking it, comparing it against as many documented facts as you can possibly lay your hands on.
With special thanks to Ken Mansell. Music by late, great, much missed Peter Gelling. His music can be heard on Spotify.